The U.S. government used to spend very little on defense and military expenses, about 1% of gross domestic product across the nation. This all would change when the U.S. found themselves in a global battle against communism in World War II. Since this war, the U.S. defense spending has never been under 3.6 GDP. During the war, the U.S. had to spend as much as needed, of course. During World War II, defense and military spending reached around 41% GDP in 1945. During the 20th century, there were two major spikes in military spending, World War I and World War II. By the end of World War I, military spending went from 1 to 22% of GDP. During World War II, spending peaked at about 41%, then declined back to 2 or 3% GDP once the war was over. There are many reasons to why the U.S. put so much money towards military spending, but it had to start somewhere. War demanded of materials and weaponry. Communism pushed us to further our technology and to prove ourselves better than other countries. This is where the U.S. spending towards fighting enemy forces raised for the first time not only in military and defense spending, but in advancing our technology. The Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the United States' effort to fight communism and stop the spread, they had to spend billions of dollars on advancing technology. Anything they could do to beat the Soviets. The Cold War was one of the first peaks of U.S. military spending, leading the U.S. towards the World Wars with their own demands of spending, but already prepared and more advanced than any other military force. In recent years, or in our current millennium, military spending has had more important problems to deal with. The 9/11 terrorist attack on important U.S. buildings in 2001 changed our defense spending, and defense spending started to increase in two stages. First, it increased to 4.6% by 2005 for the invasion of Iraq, and then to 5% in 2008 for the surge in Iraq. Spending increased even more to 5.7% in 2011 with the larger fights in Afghanistan. There have been many attempts to cut U.S. military spending, but only some have been successful. No attempts stand out. In many occasions, they attempt to downsize forces or amount of personnel instead of reducing spending.
The United States is the world's largest military spender. U.S. spending dwarfs the budget of the second largest spender, China. For every dollar China spends on its military, the U.S. spends $2.77, nearly tripling China's expenditure. In 2015, U.S. military spending was estimated to be 54% of all federal discretionary spending, a total of $598.5 billion. The Department of Defense's activities are also included in military spending. These include war spending, nuclear weapons spending, international military assistance, and other Pentagon-related spending. Discretionary spending for 2015 was $1.11 trillion. Throughout the decade post 9/11, military spending in the USA increased by 50%. Education, healthcare, public transit, and science increased by only 13.5% during this decade. There's a clear trend where the majority of the government's money is being put towards. Homeland Security, which was established in 2002, spending includes about $16 billion in expenses. These also include funding for law enforcement, border control, and other pseudo-military expenses. Non-military Department of Homeland Security funding is about $43 billion in the year 2015. World military spending in 2015 was more than $1.6 trillion, the U.S. being 37% of the total. U.S. military expenditures are the size of the next 7 largest military budgets in the world combined. The extreme focus on military spending is affecting other areas of our country that need funding too. but these contrasting views seem to be overlooked by the government for a better military.
Military spending, as you know, is not as simple as it seems. It turns out there's a lot more to it than expected. Back in 2008, when Obama came into office, he promised to cut back on it. Then, in 2011, for example, it was decided that annual military budget be $664.84 billion. However, at the end of the year, it went over budget by $18 billion. This was partly because of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, which were included in the federal budget. This also means that by spending so much on our defense and military, we don't have as much to spend on other things. For example, in 2012, the United States spent more on its defense than science and research by 16 folds. In billions, that is. In 2011, for instance, we spent more on our military than we have in all 50 plus years of NASA's existence. And veterans-wise, only 3.1% of the entire budget is spent on family housing for them, for the thousands of veterans. At 9% of the national GDP in 1962, the military budget has finally fallen to a 3%. However, it had a huge bump up in 1980 to 1992, from 4.3% to 6% and back down. However, once again it rose from its slow fall. In 2001, from 3% to 5% to 2010, presumably because of the interference in the Middle East. And now, in 2016, it's back at 3%. So, what can we do to fix this? Well, simply put, fewer troops are needed to defend the United States than are needed to police the world. Just bringing home US troops currently deployed in Western Europe and Japan would result in direct savings of about $25 billion per year. If we cut on weapons, we will automatically cut on training, personnel, and the weapons themselves. Veterans, of the 700,000 men and women who served in the Gulf War, 45% filed for disability benefits. Of this 45%, 88% were approved. On average, Gulf War veterans receive $6,506 yearly, which amounts to $4.3 billion paid out annually by the US government. If we cut down on the number of soldiers active and reserve today, we can save on serving veterans later on, and more importantly, potentially saving lives. However, for all of this to work, it is quite uneconomical to simply just cut it all quickly, all at once. For example, as we are doing right now, the budget percentage of the national GDP has over time lowered to a low 3%. If it just gets slashed, then that will harm the economy strongly, as the private sector won't take over immediately, just like the sharp cut in military spending hammered the economy last year. All in all, the only solution is growth, to grow out of it, to wait and slowly lower and cut our budget and spending, leaving room for quick growth in other sectors.